In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on quantities concerning responses one provides in terms of subjective self-reports. One can infer distinct conducts within another's self meaningful to develop knowledge, elaborative within the communications. One is concerned with elaborating prior existing knowledge of the self to infer underlying patterns within the mind-body connections, concerned with inferences into individual preferences of free agents. One infers within free agents meaningful qualities codified into quantities, communicating the well-defined combinations of analytic terms as one means to describe certain intrinsic processes and intrinsic properties derived from the unique processes and or unique properties one is interested in inferring, underlying characteristics of the self, to infer unique patterns of cause and effect dynamico-associações within distinctions between only one individual free agent, to determine whether or not one can develop elaborative self-knowledge in terms of the complexity of our own mind-body connections within a more practical, grounded inference, to infer consistently domain-specific conducts predicting the highly dynamical, highly difficult to predict mind-body connection causations to the conducts one engages within day-to-day experiences. Say one is interested in determining if walking is a distinct characteristic to communicate intrinsic motivations in an individual who engages in the satisfaction of the underlying psychological need for individual autonomy, on taking different routes to the same location to be able to engage more meaningfulness on their walk. One may conduct this quantitative data collection with taking pictures as one themselves goes on a walk, and compares from 2 weeks, a total of 14 different days of taking qualitative pictures. One has distinct dates of 14 as a numerator. One can add across 14 days one engaged in taking photographs, while controlling for the reason one wanted to go for those walks, concerned with whether or not one actually factually goes for the walk that much time. But then it's like, well, I guess I always go for a walk, and I was just doing this extra thing to take pictures on this walk. And I noticed that across the different pictures, even though I went to the same location, there are many different meaningful similarities with distinct areas of my meaningful concern. Upon retrospect, did satisfy an underlying psychological need, deriving meaningfulness from moment to moment across distinct internal and or external conditions, connecting what one infers is the aesthetic experiences one experiences on those walks as meaningful, as one elaborates on prior existing meaningful experiences drawn from some existing priors to infer intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties one is more meaningfully satisfied by in terms of its connection to one's underlying psychological needs, allowing for one to cultivate some self-knowledge in terms of valued conduct. The value of walking one may meaningfully enjoy with distinct analytic terms to communicate the explanatory facts as to why and what is meaningful to one, to communicate the quantities in response combinative of the distinct characteristics and or intrinsic properties. Meaningfully 9, 6, and 3 are meaningful in terms of quantifying any distinct combination of intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, as with 3 means more one can infer a middle score, as to infer from 3 meaningfully similar responses the meaningful bare minimum criteria to infer a meaningful average in terms of the order existing between numbers with meaningful similarity characteristics, to aggregate distinct meaningful responses across different instances, to be able to infer underlying patterns within mind-body connections and or conducts associated with scores within 1 to 3, amongst 1 to 6, amongst 1 to 9, with the most meaningful scores combined from meaningful similarities 3, 6, and 9, if not more. Concerned with the aggregation of data, one can infer averages with distinct increased internal and or external validity as aggregation increases to these meaningful stepping stones 3, 6, and 9, to improve inference in terms of complexity, be it one provides a high score of 3 across 6 distinct communications, the likelihood of one engaging in X conduct associated with those underlying characteristics is meaningfully more likely to operate in a positive direction of meaningful effect, as to mean, be it certain BADAX cause-effect dynamic associations, inferring BAD relations in terms of the comparative analysis to infer the relations between BAD associated logically to connect some intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties concerned with variable B to some intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties concerned with variable D, to infer conducts associated with BAD within X, the conduct of one's meaningful concern, to infer underlying communications of aesthetic preference on those walks, connecting the amount of times one takes pictures of trees resembling amphibians, meeting one who sees bulb-like structures on the tree, wart-like reminders of a toad, more some the similar to the toad, the frog, which is quite different than the toad, living most of its life in water, distinct from the toad on land, near not and far the water swimming apparatuses of the frog. Think less an amphibian and more meaningfully closer to reptiles, yet exists meaningfully similar in terms of distinct characteristics as the frog, which is a well-defined amphibian, mobile in land and water, engaging most of its life within aquatic environments, requiring the hydration of water within its skin. Meaningful to one's inference is the combinative characteristics within one's interest in exploring one's aesthetic preferences on those walks within the photos, aggregating distinct characteristics in comparative analysis concerned with plants with unique properties distinct amongst the similars characteristics. Meaningful similarities are drawn in terms to infer more meaningfully the conscious thought processes one engages as one is engaging photography on a walk, taking photos of the bulbs on trees, reminder of the warts of toads. To think more meaningfully as to infer distinct characteristics to one's aesthetic preferences within taking photographs, aggregating distinct scores, quantitative to the code, any meaningful shape and form concerned with the bulb on a tree can be given a score of 1. Compared to the intrinsic properties one can infer from other unique characteristics and properties, including distinct objects, because maybe meaningfully one takes more pictures of one's hands and or may take pictures of garbage cans meaningfully to be able to create distinct categoricals from the 2 prior BAD in comparison upon inference in noticing patterns, aggregating 3 distinct pictures of trash cans, enough to create a distinct intra-categorical in comparison to the intercategoricals. Aesthetic preferences combine meaningful similarities to infer reciprocal relations between existing intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, to infer underlying aesthetic preferences across the distinct characteristics, including maybe the spherical shape within the trash cans. One tends to take more pictures of circular trash cans compared to rectangular ones with more cylindrical structures, engaging the dynamical structuring of the mind, inferring the form and shape from more spherical, circular, cylindrical images, including the tree, which is more cylindrical, and as it increases in spherical bulb-like properties, one tends to take more pictures, increasing the calculus within one's inference to conduct meaningful quantitative analysis in terms of the combinative intrinsic processes and or characteristics, to infer underlying preferences for certain shapes derived from the photographs, as one is inferring complexity within mind-body connections, to cultivate self-knowledge, elaborating on some existing priors, to complexify one's own meaningful knowledge with simplifications created through the coding of distinct intrinsic processes and or properties inferred from the different themes within one's direct perception, to connect the subject matter of thoughts to distinct topics of one's aesthetic concern in terms of the aesthetic experiences, only meaningful in terms of the underlying intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties concerned with the shape and form in this case, to be able to communicate existing characteristics. One is inferring from the intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties to well-defined communications concerned with communicating the meaningful intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, harder to communicate and easier access knowledge than the intrinsic meaningfulness within distinct characteristics and or meaningful communications describing one's own experience in relation to the perception of the internal and or external characteristics meaningful to elaborate one's knowledge concerned to the intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, communicating not just the distinct qualitative components within the variable one is inferring, be it X equals a tree's dynamical structuring with distinct shapes and swaying of branches in the springtime, sprouting different bulbs of flower and leaf to communicate aesthetic transformations one is more sensitive to, exploring the complexities of beauty within the beautiful experiential encounters one experiences, meaning and affect association to distinct characteristics to infer preference associated with direct and or indirect intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, to develop elaborative categoricals into preferences within the self, to develop elaborations on self-knowledge, cultivating meaningfulness within the distinct characteristics prior to the inference into intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, with more subjectivity derived from one's own subjectivity. Direct perception engages the component part and or processes to infer logical connections within higher order thinking processes elaborated from the lower order cognitions into higher order cognition, to be able to communicate meaningful effectivenesses from the complexities within the aesthetic experiences written and recorded within photo meaningful communications, communicating on photographs with descriptions one writes in a word processing document to communicate the distinct intrinsic processes and or properties. One can infer distinct intrinsic processes and or properties to increase the numerators within distinct variables, to aggregate and infer distinct underlying preferences of one's own self. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep looking at those upside.